Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. The girl, who was the Lord's secretary, inquired of His Highness what he thought of place A8. He said it was the Rook, for Charles Viscount is of moderate views and maintains neutrality. Yes, and lately he has increased his wealth and fame by trading abroad. He has 2 daughters and 1 younger son. Then the girl Poe asked if he wanted to put him in his place F6. The man replied that a horse should be put there, for in the person of the hard-headed Marquis Brown, it would look just perfect. Marquis Grine, who is in position G5, is on good terms with other aristocrats, and he had recently received information that this particular person had reorganized the scandalous attack. The girl said with a smile on her face that this evening was apparently going to be incredibly fun, because he had so thoughtfully arranged all the guests. Duke, for his part, replied that this was indeed true, for the idea of making the ballroom in the form of a chessboard was excellent. Positions on the board are determined by the relationship to the king, and people walk around the room as if of their own free will, moving around the chessboard. The man also summarized that apparently he would have to become one of the pawns again and go into politics. He told the girl Valente that this was just a great lesson for her, and she, in turn, inquired what the basic strategy would be. The man replied that it would be pat. He was referring to the situation in a game of chess and other chess-type games in which the side having the right of move cannot take advantage of it, because all its pieces and pawns are either removed from the board or prevented from making a move by the rules, the king not being under check. And Valente, when she heard that, she said it was just a great choice on his part. She was about to say something else, but the Duke interrupted her and said that despite being a debutante, however, she felt more nervous than he was. When the girl heard this, she giggled and thought that it was only natural, because since that day, she had been living with the sole purpose of helping His Highness transform from a monster prince to a true emperor. And this debut, which will happen this evening, is her first step toward success. The man suddenly stepped closer to Valente and said that, if it was between the two of them, he was incredibly nervous as well. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked, "Is that really so?" But then tried to reassure him, saying that he didn't need it at all, you see. Right now he had no flaws and he looked just perfect. The Duke, smiling, said that 2 months ago he never thought things would turn out so well. This meeting had turned out for the best for him after all. He also told Valente that it was only because of her that his broken clock started ticking again, and he's incredibly happy that she helped him make it happen. The secretary chuckled and said it had been a great honor to serve and protect him, and help and guide him all this time. And then she said that it was already time for him to go out, so it could not be delayed. However, the man suddenly held out his hand to her and said that in that case he wanted her not to stand behind him, but instead to walk beside him as a partner. He also said that he wants her to do it, because she is his lady secretary, and he is very proud of such a girl. In fact, the lady secretary helps aristocrats in the social sphere, and also prepares them for their debut. And if her lord's debut is successful, she has the opportunity to become his personal secretary when he takes the throne. The Duke turned toward the exit and suggested that they now go and build their chessboard to make sure everything went right. And as soon as they began to enter, the butler told all the guests to greet properly the first prince of the Casteltsum Empire. In fact, in her past life, Valente had lived in this empire, and it had been completely destroyed, just as her life had been cut short. She was the illegitimate daughter of a commoner, and the aristocrats, unfortunately because of her status and nature of birth, her mother was killed right before her eyes when she was still young. She later learned that her mother's death had been arranged by her own father. He did it for some money there, selling the girl into slavery in order to put that money into one of his businesses. Valente worked until her death for 20 years. In the end, however, her country was simply destroyed, and she starved to death by one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The girl wasn't sure when she started living in the other world, whether it was her past life or just a tragic prediction of the future. Even so, she knows full well that her present life is a precious new opportunity that has been given by the Lord. After her death, she had a strange feeling as if her body was being sucked into something, and when she woke up, she was right in front of her mother's freshly covered grave. As far as she could remember, it was just before she was sold into slavery. Valente didn't realize what was happening for a while, but then, standing in front of that grave of her own dead mother, She swore to herself that she needed to get away from the horrible family, she walls, and not end up the same as in her past life. And so, according to the imperial calendar of Castelsum, it was August of the 450th year. She graduated from her academy and was the top graduate there. Although in her previous life she was born the illegitimate child of an aristocrat, and was unable to attend her academy because of that, she never thought that she could become a lady of the imperial palace and even wear the cap of an alumna. Valenti never imagined that her graduation would put a wide smile on Josephine's face, for she was the most demanding and difficult teacher there was. Oh, and to top it all off, woman, this one was perpetually dissatisfied with something. But now, as the girl was graduating, this teacher smiled the brightest and was proud of her. She said that this student had diligently completed a series of educational courses as a lady of the imperial palace, and in the end she achieved amazing results, so hereby award them a certificate of superior qualification, which was honestly earned by hard work. The teacher, while handing over her diploma, said that she had done a wonderful job, and the woman also hoped that she would continue to achieve the same results. Valenti was just incredibly happy and thanked the woman for such praise and the opportunity to learn from the best. Of course, by the same results, she meant getting the opportunity to work directly for a member of the imperial family. However, the girl was still grateful for such a warm release and words of pride. But the girl, unlike in her previous life, at least she was not taken into slavery and did not die a tragic death, so it was already a small victory for her. Valenti held her diploma up, and everyone immediately began to applaud, congratulating her on such a great accomplishment. She even felt very embarrassed at how her friends and familiar classmates were cheering for her victory. However, after graduation, first of all, she needs to achieve a future development in which the monster prince is not taken away in a carriage to the territory of an enemy country. At last the girl was happy and could make a fresh start without any danger. And all because what she's about to do is the best thing she could bring to her empire. At this time, in the first garden of the imperial palace, a man was working in the courtyard as he always did. However, he suddenly felt incredibly hot. The sun hadn't risen yet, and he was already tired beyond belief. He had certainly been told before he settled in that it was a rather creepy place. And although Prince Monster is a rather strange man, but he did not think that a man could appear in such a place at a late hour. It was rumored that just looking at the prince would make the case melt into a ghastly agony, and you just die. So the man was pretty much terrified when he took the job. At that moment, he suddenly heard some strange sounds behind him, and when he turned around, he saw a black silhouette, from which only his eyes could be seen. The worker was incredibly frightened. He started screaming loudly and, dropping his tool, ran off somewhere in the distance. In fact, when the prince was very young, his mother was seriously ill, and he would go to her room to visit her. His brother Evan, who was 13 years old at the time, turned to His Highness and told him to remain calm. But the boy wouldn't listen. He was so angry that he was ready to tear everyone apart, despite his small age. Then Evan grabbed his hand and said in a quiet voice that there were a lot of people watching him. And it was true. The maids who were present were cautiously watching everything that was going on in order to spread good rumors. But soon the boys entered the room where his mother had already passed away. They put a special cloth over her face so that the children would not be frightened. First of all, the prince apologized. He knelt down and, turning to Evan, asked, "What has he ever done wrong in this life?" The boy cried loudly. He didn't understand why he was being punished, and Evan, who was standing behind him, was shaking with fear and grief. He turned to the prince and said that he had done nothing wrong. Then the boy said that if that was really so, then what should he do next? Evan recommended that he never again show any political intentions or aspirations. He should avoid all choices and decisions, not sticking around until he has the strength to protect those close to him. However, the first goal for him is to survive in such a cruel world by himself. Her Majesty the Empress always wanted him to grow up safe. So with her gone, he has to learn how to protect himself. In that case, the guy made a decision to start right away. He decided to become someone who no longer exists. He was going to spend the rest of his life in darkness, for the sake of no more harm and no more of that pain. And he was going to do it until the day when he could proudly go out into the world. Many years had passed since then, and the boy was now quite grown up. Soon after graduating from the academy, Valenti summoned an elderly faculty member to visit her. She was helping her students get some prestigious jobs after graduation, and when the girl came in to see her, she inquired if what she was being called was true. The woman replied that was correct, and also said that she had been waiting to finally see her. After that, she turned to Valenti and inquired what it was about why the girl said she didn't want to serve in the imperial palace, and she wanted to know the reason for such a harsh refusal. Valenti replied that she just wanted to be sent to His Highness the Prince's palace. When the woman heard this, she was very surprised and asked if it was really true. The woman replied to her that certainly every year they gave the top graduates the opportunity to choose the direction and place they planned to work in later in life. But she also wondered if the girl was even aware of all the risks and what exactly it meant to enter the first prince's abode. This is exactly the kind of place where everyone tries not to stay more than one day. And that's why they send the girls with the lowest grades there every year. And of course, now they just can't afford to lose someone as valuable as her by sending her to that place. Valenti, of course, thanked her for being so concerned about her. From the beginning, however, she had approached her training in such a way that she would go to the first prince and help him at the first opportunity. So now she's definitely ready to commit, and she's urging to send her there. The teacher signed the letter, saying she had high hopes for her as she made her way to the top of the academic ladder without family support or outside help. However, she can't help herself. Since she's really asking for it, it should be fulfilled. The woman also wished the girl good luck, and so Valenti's first day of work finally arrived. She got all dressed up and went to the estate. Of course, many people might think that she made the most insane choice to turn down a job at the Imperial Palace, where she would have been guaranteed a huge career advancement, and take this thankless job. That's just crazy. However, that would mean that she would become the second prince's lady. In fact, at this moment, the empress's only son was the second prince, Cao, and in his past life, instead of the first prince, he took the throne of emperor, and that idiot just took over and destroyed the entire country in just 2 years of his reign. So bringing the girl back to life at this point is just the perfect opportunity to prevent him from becoming emperor for anything and ruining everything that is. Valenti still couldn't believe that some parts of the imperial palace were kept in such a terrible state. As she got closer and closer, she suggested that she might have gotten the wrong road altogether, but hopefully this was still the very abode of the first prince, and that she wouldn't have to go back. The girl looked around and saw everything very abandoned and dirty around her, and before she could think about it, she realized that there were probably no servants of the imperial family in this place at all. The girl walked closer to the entrance and sighed heavily, thinking about the fact that in such a place the prince had once shone very brightly and lived the best moments of his life. However, he is now spending his life in such a harsh place while wearing the face of a monster prince. Plus, to top it all off, Valenti felt a little sad. But then she realized that she should never give in to her emotions in such situations. She had to remain absolutely calm and confident. As soon as she stepped inside, she noticed that it was even darker than outside. She was annoyed by the mess that was everywhere, and she wondered what the servants were doing in this place. Suddenly, some man appeared and addressed the girl. He thanked her for coming all this long and difficult way. When Valenti turned around, she immediately saw the man. It was just Evan, a high-ranking duke and aide-de-camp to the first prince. He looked rather cruel, but he was still the favorite of all the girls. She smiled and said it was a pleasure to finally meet him, and was about to say her name, but the man interrupted her. Evan said that this palace didn't need any lady, so she'd better just go home. When the girl heard this, she was simply stunned. She couldn't believe that she would be fired on her first day of work. After all, this was her very first job position, and she considered this turn of events rather abrupt and sudden. However, at this moment, she smilingly handed him a paper and said that as a person who had received an official order, only the first prince could fire her, and she was not ready to make that decision until she heard the reason for her dismissal. Evan, in turn, asked her to refrain from making unnecessary statements, because he was only conveying the words and decisions of His Highness. After that, he turned around and told her to just leave, since the prince himself didn't want to see her. Valenti objected and asked him to stop, and to tell His Highness that she hoped he would keep the promise he had made as much as 8 years ago. Evan, hearing these words, was immediately interested and looked at the girl in surprise, not realizing if she was serious. In fact, about 8 years ago, there had been one very interesting incident when Valenti was still working as a servant for an aristocrat. Making her way through the huge crowd of people, she didn't understand why there were so many of them. She was carrying a whole bag of apples in her hands. But suddenly, someone in the crowd pushed her, and she fell down, scattering all her groceries in the street. She was very upset because she had dropped all her apples, and she didn't know what to do now, because she realized that if the owner found out about it, she would be scolded. At that moment, however, some blonde-haired guy came up to her and asked if she was okay, and if he could help her stand up. He held one of her apples in his hands to help pick them. Valenti recognized him at a glance. He had shiny blonde hair that shone like stars in the night sky. He also had brilliant snow-white skin and emerald eyes. She couldn't believe he was only 2 years older than her, for his face seemed etched in stone. She immediately remembered that his name was Durek, and he was a prince who had become a monster. During the destruction of the empire, he was captured by his enemies and taken to his country. At that moment, Valenti thought that her life that she had lived in the past might really have been just some kind of dream. However, Valenti knew that his mother, Empress Abella, had been poisoned, and it had caused him to become a monster prince. But until that moment, all her memories were in doubt. She got fed up with her family and ran away without even knowing what exactly would happen in the future. However, Prince Durek was very intelligent and handsome. He possessed straightforward and good political beliefs, excellent martial arts skills, and he was loved by absolutely all the people of the empire. Valenti really didn't want the man she admired and was so proud of to go down the same tragic path as her past life. Then suddenly the guy was approached and told they had to go. Durek immediately started to turn around and leave, and the girl thought that if fate itself had presented her with this meeting with him, she very much did not want everything to repeat the same as in the past. That's why she went straight to the boy, and then with complete confidence in her voice, she asked if he would one day become emperor. But then she rephrased her phrase and said that he should definitely become emperor. Durek didn't say anything to that. He only just stood there looking at her. The girl stood up, immediately uncomfortable, and she just wished he would respond in a positive way, and she would be calm then. He was silent for a while, and then he suddenly started laughing loudly. But he answered anyway, saying that he would promise her that. She also introduced herself, saying that her mother called her simply Len, and asked that the lad by no means forget his promise and be sure to keep it. The prince smiled and said that he would be sure to remember her and get things done. After that, he went to the guard who was just calling him. Valenti suddenly had a rather strange feeling, as if she was just in a dream, and she realized that it had been a long time since she had felt such warm emotions. So Eden decided to take her to the prince after all, to let him figure out what to do with her. Valenti thought about the fact that if she, as someone who saw a better future, could become a close ally to the members of the imperial family, she could prevent even the second prince who had ruined the country from becoming emperor. And if she told anyone about the future she saw, they would only laugh her off, pointing fingers at her origins and saying she was just a commoner's daughter, the bastard child of an aristocrat who couldn't be trusted and was too stupid to draw any conclusions. But now the girl was absolutely certain that the horrible future was very real. She knew that if in her past life the monster prince had been captured by enemies and taken to the territory of her country, then she had to stop it and prevent it from happening in this life. At that moment, they stopped near the large doors. Eden warned that any rash actions or sudden movements were forbidden. The girl smiled and said that of course she wouldn't do anything like that, so he needn't worry. Then the man knocked, and they were told they could come in. As soon as they entered, Evan said that a new lady had arrived. Valenti in turn introduced herself and said that she was His Highness's new lady. The man who had been wearing a mask the whole time looked at her with an angry look and asked if that was really the case. She nodded, and then he replied that he didn't want to upset her, but he didn't need any helpers other than Evan. Valenti, when she saw him, immediately noticed his black mask and dark cloak. It was rumored that he hid his hideous appearance because he had been cursed by black magic and turned into a true monster. Everyone thought that if they heard his voice, they'd start spitting blood and their bodies would melt in horrible agony. But she knew that wasn't true. She knew perfectly well that those rumors were untrue. His best friend and assistant had worked with him and heard his voice for 10 years, and nothing had happened. Valenti replied that she was well aware of all this. The man smiled and asked if that was the case, then he'd better get to the point. She should leave, but she continued to stand where she was. Then the man looked at her in surprise and asked if she still had anything to say. And Valenti continued. She said that she had come this far and worked so hard to get the opportunity to become a lady of His Highness. At this point, she didn't contain herself and raised her voice, asking if he thought it was rude to fire her on her first day of work. The man looked at her in surprise, clearly uncomfortable with her screaming, and asked what she was even talking about. Valenti asked in surprise if he had forgotten about her. She repeated her name and reminded him that he had promised to remember her. Then she came as close as she could to the prince and told him about the incident 8 years ago in the main square when someone had grazed her shoulder. She had dropped the apples, and he had helped her pick them up. She wondered if he really meant to say he didn't remember it. But the prince, in turn, calmly replied that since it was at that time, he had seen everything with almost several dozen people in one day, so he could safely forget her. Valenti moved closer and closer to him, and wanted him to look her straight in the eye. But the guy kept looking away, and she kept saying, "Does he really not remember her?" When the man suddenly couldn't stand it, he jumped up from his seat and started yelling at her, asking what she even wanted from him and whether or not he remembered. The girl felt a little uncomfortable at the way he was yelling at her, but she asked him politely to talk to her, staring firmly and clearly into her eyes. She also said that she has always admired him and his willpower. She is a huge fan of his, so she can tell by just one look whether he is lying or just pretending. Then he sighed heavily and after a while of silence said that he seemed to recall something similar. Valenti was immediately pleased, and then wondered if he then recalled the promise he had made to her that day. The promise to become emperor. He wanted to say something to her, but the girl interrupted him and said that she did not want to hear any excuses. So he had to tell her clearly and firmly whether he remembered the promise he had made 8 years ago. She put some papers on the table and suggested that we get right down to business. Namely, she had a debut in mind for which he should prepare with her. The man was surprised when he heard that and asked if she really wanted to send him there. Valenti said that was right. He would be 20 years old in 2 months. And considering that the debut of children of special persons is usually taken from 17, just until that age she felt he was loved, he had been delayed a lot. The prince at this moment took one paper from the table and began to scrutinize it. There was too much information there that he didn't expect to hear. The girl replied that they only had 2 months left. So if they started preparing now, they would be on time and everything would go well. He in turn wondered why he should listen to her at all, and why she should help him, since he was a monster prince who was possessed by a curse. And also wondered how she was even going to make him a debutante, since he was being shunned by everyone around him. The man also apologized for such a careless promise. However, he wondered if, for the sake of their yours, she could pretend it had never happened at all, and just go on her long and happy way. The girl at this point didn't understand why on earth he was refusing to make his debut or what had even happened. Then she came closer to him and asked him to tell her honestly if he was cursed with black magic. She grabbed him by the shoulders so that he would not resist, and then wondered if he had really become a monster because of such a curse as he told everyone. In fact, in the distant past, once Empress Abella was poisoned, it was all over the news. And it was also attributed that the first prince was cursed with black magic. The newspapers said that if they looked into his eyes, their bodies would melt in a terrible agony. So they had to go to the church now and put a special protection on themselves so that nothing like that would happen. Also, many people insisted that if they heard his voice, blood would pour from every orifice of his body. And so everyone started calling the prince a monster. Of course, there were those people who didn't believe the rumors and doubted that it was really true. Many people discussed the fact that right after Empress Abella was poisoned, the head concubine Tiara took her place. And after this incident, the second principal gained a lot of popularity. But people immediately made a point of not discussing it, for if anyone heard him, his head would come off his shoulders quite quickly. All of this they considered rather suspicious. But the culprit of this incident had already been found. so people didn't think it was necessary to look into it further. However, the identity was never revealed. However, there are also rumors that it could be the monster prince himself. He looked quite handsome on the outside, but anything is possible. At that moment, Valenti stood over the man and smiled. She said she had heard that looking directly into his eyes would melt her body and make it ache. Well, judging from the fact that nothing had happened to her so far, she concluded that apparently he wasn't cursed with black magic. The girl bowed and also apologized for her show of disrespect. But in justification, she said that her purpose was to find out if he was really cursed. The man didn't react. Then he asked her what she wanted from him. The girl said with absolute certainty that she just wanted him to become emperor. Durek, head down, wondered, why on earth would she even want to do that? Of course, the reason was obvious. The girl wanted the person she so sincerely admired to become the most respected person in the country. And that was the emperor. And besides, if he doesn't become emperor, the whole country will just die, because she has seen the future and knows that their country is only waiting for one thing: destruction. Many deaths of innocent people and children, and he would just be taken away to an enemy country. Soon she died then too. That was why he simply had to become emperor. But of course Valenti couldn't tell him any of that. So she smiled and simply said that it was all because he had promised her. Her plan was pretty much spot on. First, she introduces him to everyone for his 20th birthday, which will be in 2 months. She absolutely must do it, because to debut as a member of the imperial family is to become the heir to the imperial throne, and one must do it before the second prince, or else all will be lost. Second, she needs to choose people who have become famous in her previous life and introduce them to Durek. If the aristocrats support him, the right of a man to be the first to inherit the throne will remain intact, because in politics, the strength of the bond you have formed over the years is very important. Third, meeting and marrying his future consort at the same time as the emperor ascended to the throne. Valenti realized that, by all means, he must simply find a partner. She'd be lying if she said she didn't regret anything. However, of course she wasn't. And the last point was that she would simply retire. The girl plans to use all the money she earns to build a 2-story mansion on the coast and enjoy spending the rest of her happy life. Basically, her whole strategy is to make Durek an emperor, save the country, and then live her own life resting at last. And all because she wants to enjoy life in her peaceful country, which is not threatened by any war and large-scale death. She wants to know what's in store for her, and when she does, it inspires her and keeps her moving forward. Valenti realized that it could be accomplished, since the prince's own secretary received a rather high salary. And while she was writing it all down in a separate book, she suddenly ran out of ink. She went to Evan to ask him for it, saying that she had suddenly run out of it. The man just stared at her for a while and then brought out a whole sack of some stuff. Valenti looked at him in surprise and asked, "Does she really need all this?" And he said that she had asked for her own ink. The girl said it was true. She didn't ask for that much, though. Evan in turn took back his seat, saying that if she didn't need it, she could throw it away somewhere, because he had no need for it. Valenti held up a huge bag of ink jars and was surprised that he really wanted her to take it all with her. But she didn't really need that much. When evening came, Durek sat in his office and thought about the fact that hope comes quite suddenly, just when you don't expect it at all. Until the death of his mother 8 years ago, he cherished great hopes and plans for his future. Despite the fact that people all the time only pointed their fingers in his direction with fear and called him a monster, he never forgot about his promise. Yes, even those who seemed to treat him well were only doing it for their own gain. And this girl was the only one who had made him promise to become emperor for his own good. He didn't even know if there had been a single person in his entire life, other than his own mother, who cared so much about his future. And even after 8 years, she still wants him to become an emperor. However, he still didn't understand why she wanted it so badly. Certainly, he really and truly wanted to take the position himself, but he did not understand how he would be able to do it, or if he would be able to do it at all. But at that moment, Evan suddenly walked in and addressed His Highness. He asked what he planned to do with the lady. Durek thought for a while, but didn't answer. Evan, for his part, wondered if he was afraid. The man turned away and said that he would be lying if he said he wasn't scared, and asked the deputy how he himself thought he should still act in this case. Evan replied that he was the first prince of the empire, and that fact was definitely undeniable. But the man, angry, wondered if anyone else in this world saw him as the real first prince. To this, Evan said that actually he sees him as the first prince and maybe even emperor in the future. He also said that the man shouldn't worry. The man believes that among ordinary people there are many who are still ready to support him. You just need to look for them. Durek, when he heard these words, was pleasantly surprised. Then he covered his face with his hands and said that the boy was right after all. Then he asked if the boy was going to go home. Evan replied that of course he was going to return soon. Prince told him not to overwork too much and to get a good rest when he got home. It was a little awkward in the car from this conversation, but he said that of course he would do everything. After that, he left, and the man was left alone. He looked up at the ceiling, not knowing if he could show himself in front of so many people without his mask. He didn't know if they would look at him as if he was a monster that was truly cursed by black magic. He looked toward the window and saw many shining stars. However, the moon was not visible, unfortunately. Durek thought about how the stars were like his eyes, and this girl was a bright ray of light that was slowly filling his life with new meaning. The girl stayed at the manor for the night, and when she woke up, it was still too early in the morning. Her eyes were tingling from being up so early. Valenti realized that it was too early, but she still needed to start working to make any progress. Soon she packed up and went out. As she passed the garden, she noticed that it was quite well maintained. She also thought about the fact that she was even starting to feel better and more inspired because of this small, clean area. She then shifted her gaze to the first prince's abode and realized that a full day's work awaited her in that gloomy place. The girl couldn't believe that they really didn't want to do anything about it, because before entering the grounds of the estate, everything was shining straight up, and it was very pleasant to even just look at. All the trees around the estate are downright rotten, and not a single flower grows in the garden. At the moment she entered the manor, it was summer. However, it felt like a snowless winter. That's why she assumed he was nicknamed the Monster Prince. The part of the palace she'd just entered was rather carelessly managed. Dust everywhere. You could even see mold somewhere. And the cobwebs were an integral part of the place. The girl also noticed that the curtains were not ironed at all, and the shelves were not washed. And she did not realize if she was really in the place where the first prince of the empire lived. But at that moment, she suddenly heard someone laughing behind her. When she turned around, she saw several maids sitting nearby, laughing loudly. She thought about the fact that it was still a little over 3 hours before the end of their shift, and they were just allowing themselves to chat during working hours, not fulfilling their professional duties. One of the maids finished laughing, but wanted to tell another story. But then she noticed that Valenti was looking at her. The girl, who was staring at them with a stern gaze, thought about the fact that she finally wanted to work, apparently. But the maid, for her part, just turned around and continued giggling to tell her story, simply ignoring her. Certainly Valenti understood the difficulties and times the maids had, but they felt they had no hierarchy or authority at all, and lived as they pleased. The girl wouldn't want it to come to that, but apparently she would have to use her new powers after all. She came closer to them and shouted loudly, asking what they were doing during working hours. Then the maid who was telling this fascinating story to her co-workers looked at her with contempt and asked her who she was. Valenti replied that she was the new lady of the house, who had received direct orders from the imperial family to oversee and work in the house. Then she wondered if they hadn't been told about it yet. The maids immediately looked at each other. Then the girl said that apparently the lady was only responsible for the social order in society and the prince directly, and she had nothing to do with them. And that is why it is not in her authority to tell them what to do and what not to do. She is not their boss. And at that moment, when Valenti looked more closely, she realized that this girl was Misha, who had hurt her all the time in her past life. The girl, for her part, said she kept wondering what kind of curious lady had come to see them, and it ended up being Valenti. Valenti, in her turn, raised her head up and said that she was a high-ranking lady, so she would not tolerate insulting words against her. Apparently, they would have to start from the basics, namely, the rules of communication with people who were higher in status than them. Misha, at this point, smiling wickedly, bowed and said with a sneer in her voice that she was sorry for what had happened. And then she wondered how best to address her, for to call her lady of the palace was somehow too respectful, for she was not a lady at all. Valenti didn't like the way she said it, because it was already an insult. And besides, it was also part of her important obligations, which she could not ignore. It was part of her job to correct poor staff discipline. Then she turned to the maids and wondered if it was their head maid who had taught them such lewd behavior. But now she was a high-ranking lady of the palace, and they obeyed His Highness the Prince, and she was his chief assistant, so they obeyed her too. And by allowing themselves to say such things to her, they insult the prince himself. And then she asked the maids if they wanted to be executed for insulting the imperial family. The girls, when they heard this, were immediately frightened. They began to justify their actions, saying that she had simply misunderstood everything. But Valenti asked that they bring the head maid into the room immediately. The maids began to say it was not necessary, but then she raised her voice and told them to bring her in at once, not to say anything, but to comply. When a new elder came to the palace, it was the head maid's job to teach the junior staff everything. The girl thought that she was probably to blame, because the head maid had probably neglected her duties. Then an rather elderly woman came into the room. She turned to the lady and asked if she had been offended in any way by her charges. Valenti was very surprised when she heard this. Then she said that her maids treated her very disrespectfully and wondered if she thought it was all right. The older maid said that it had been long enough since they had had a real lady in the palace, so they must have forgotten how to treat her. She asked if she meant to say that they were completely innocent, and thus justified their rudeness. The maid replied that was correct. Valenti was surprised that she wasn't even going to scold them, and then said that let it be up to her. Perhaps it really had been too long since the last lady had appeared in the palace, and they didn't know how to behave properly. But she wondered if it wasn't her duty as head maid to teach them everything. She should have been notified of her arrival in the first place, and prepared the maids for it. The head maid said that, just so she understood, her appearance had not been reported to anyone, as everyone was sure she would leave the position on the first day, because that was how everyone ended up, and they thought it would be the same with the girl. That was why she decided that it wasn't worth burdening the girls with unnecessary things. After all, they were already very busy. Valenti smiled when she heard that, and said that even that did not negate the fact that they had been notified of the arrival of a high-ranking bureaucrat, and it was their responsibility to notify the junior staff and remind them how to behave. After all, they don't get a higher salary than other maids for nothing. They have a lot more responsibilities, so they have to do at least a fraction of that. The maid wanted to contradict her, but she said she wasn't finished yet. She thought it was strange that the head maid was interrupting her and not letting her boss finish. She thinks that this place is a mess. The maid in turn began to shout, saying that she was truly sorry, but Valenti in turn turned to her and told her that she would only ask her once, and inquired if she was fully performing her assigned duties. The girl bowed and said in a trembling voice that, unfortunately, that wasn't entirely true. Valenti replied that it was a problem, because the incompetence of a senior maid could affect the entire staff. And if there were someone else in her place, maybe those maids would call her correctly. In other words, the girl is just neglecting her duties by not doing them at all. When the maid heard this, she was very surprised. And Valenti in turn said the article and paragraph of the Imperial Palace Labor Law, which stated that all Imperial Palace employees must carefully perform their duties. And if the rule is violated, a high-ranking bureaucrat who oversees the personnel matters of the palace concerned can strip an employee of his or her position for breach of duty. The maid lay back down again and told the lady that she was incredibly sorry and begged simply for forgiveness, saying that she had made an incredibly big mistake and there was really no excuse. Valenti looked at her sternly and said that if she wanted to continue as head maid, she could not neglect her duties and needed to train the staff thoroughly. She also said that the girl should be sure to punish her subordinates for their missteps as all their misbehaviors were committed. The girl also added that you could start, for example, with Misha, because she does not want to see such an incompetent person in the prince's abode. The other 3 should be deprived of their salaries for 3 months, so that they know what the consequences are. After that, the girl looked at the head maid and said that she needed to organize things so that every corner of this palace would be completely cleaned. She wants to see this place clean when she starts working. Valenti also asked that they be sure to replace the torn curtains on the windows with new ones and start tending the trees in the garden. And the ones that are already completely beyond saving, you need to organize a team of men and replace just them with new ones. She wants the maids to tidy up the garden at last. The head maid immediately bowed and said that she would start working on it right away and everything would be accomplished. Valenti said that this palace belonged to His Highness the first prince who would be the future ruler of their empire, and to keep it in this condition was a spit in the face of his reputation as well as a breach of public duty. She also said that if it happens again, they can expect no more leniency. She would definitely punish them to the fullest extent, including for this incident. The maid said they understood and started to leave. As soon as the footsteps died down, Valenti breathed out a sigh of relief, thinking that it was finally quiet. It was early in the morning, and the maids were still making noise and laughing loudly. Soon after, the girl went to her office. She was sitting and writing something down in her notebook when suddenly someone knocked on her door. It was her good old tutor. She turned to Lady Valenti and asked if she could have a moment of her precious time. The girl replied that of course, and then they left to go to a more comfortable place to talk. Everything around them was already beginning to glow. The older maid was yelling at everyone else and telling them to clean up all the cobwebs, work faster, and told someone to unload new curtains. They had already been brought in. Valenti followed her teacher and assumed that most likely the various rumors had already spread. That was why she had arrived. Then the teacher said that information had reached her that the girl had expelled a servant girl named Misha from the palace of the first prince. The girl replied that this was absolutely true. She said she understood. Then she asked Valenti's people to let her say something and warn her. The girl was wary, and the old lady said she had heard the story from the beginning. "I'm well aware that the maid made a mistake." The older maid in turn said that she would take care of her upbringing. The old lady asked that she should turn a blind eye to the incident, and that she should not be kicked out either. She assured that such disrespectful behavior on her part would never happen again. Valenti was so surprised that she couldn't even answer her for a while. She didn't understand why she needed it at all. Then she inquired if the woman really wanted the maid she had banished to continue working in the palace of the first prince. The woman in turn replied that it was exactly like that. Then the girl asked why she was so insistent on it. At that moment she remembered the words of Misha, who had wondered why the bureaucrats who ran the palace interfered with the direct supervision of the junior staff. And then it was immediately clear to her, Misha is the maid of the imperial palace. To put it in other words, she is a confidant who has been assigned to directly oversee the prince's every move. Valenti in turn turned to the teacher and said that in that case, wasn't that a more serious reason to definitely expel her from the first prince's palace? She said that she was a lady who belonged to the imperial palace, they directly to the prince, and it was her duty to keep an eye on the first prince's entourage so that no competent persons were hanging around him. And she's seen Misha's incompetence firsthand. So she can't let her keep working there. She explained that it was all contrary to what the teacher himself had taught her, and she had built her education on that. So there's no way she's taking her back. The old lady in turn wondered if she couldn't at least make a small exception for Misha, but the girl insisted and said that unfortunately, she could not undermine her authority. The woman replied that she understood and added that she would report to Her Majesty the Empress. Valenti thanked her, and then the woman bowed and said she would do her best to make sure she was as comfortable as possible in her work environment. The girl did not reply to this, but only said goodbye to her teacher. She was proud of the fact that she was able to defend her position and did not give up. She then returned to her office, gathered some papers, and came to His Highness, saying that this was what he would study. Durek looked at her in surprise at that moment and couldn't believe she was so excited. The girl explained that she had brought a book about small and big social incidents, and asked if he wanted to study it all. He replied that he was not particularly interested. The man added that even though he is imprisoned in his palace and can't get out, he still gets a newspaper and reads it to keep up with all the news. Valenti smiled and thought that even though he hadn't been out of the palace for so long, he still hadn't lost his pep. Then she held out her hand and said that he probably didn't know everything, so learning would be good for him. But Durek objected and said that it was not so. Then the girl suggested a quiz. She would ask him questions and he would answer to prove his competence. Seeing his surprised face, she asked if he really didn't want it. Then, apologizing, she said that there was no choice left, and the only way was to teach him from the beginning. She then pointed to a piece of paper and explained that the white part was the paper, and the black part was the letters to be read. The man was annoyed, but the girl said he should just read, that's all. Then she asked him what he thought about making a bet. Valenti wants to make some kind of bet, as he realizes that the tests may not be very interesting. She added that he seems confident he can handle the test, so she suggests making a bet to make it more interesting. The man didn't answer anything, and then she asked him what he thought about it after all. Eventually he agreed, and the girl said fine. She then asked him what he thought about the loser granting the wish. Durek inquired in surprise, and Valenti explained that the loser would be obliged to fulfill the winner's every wish. At this point, Durek got excited and said it meant he could ask her to resign of her own accord and leave. The girl watched his demeanor and realized, from the way he presented his hand to his mouth and coughed nervously, that he was quite the same as he had been in the past, except he pretended to be old enough then. But now he pretends to be completely unpanicked and full of confidence. Despite that, she decided to go for that bet and said she wouldn't pretend like she hadn't heard anything and would fulfill all his requests. So Valenti moved on to the first question. Some time had passed since then, and the man had answered almost all her questions perfectly correctly. She was surprised, asking how it was possible, and the man replied that it was somehow too easy. He thought it would be much harder. Valenti began to ask only difficult questions by her standards, but he still continued to answer them successfully. Then she wondered what difficult question to ask him that he would not be able to answer, and soon came up with the idea. If he answered wrongly, he would have to grant her 2 wishes, and if rightly, she would have to grant him 2 wishes. The man was a little wary when he heard this, but agreed. Valenti was pleased and thought she didn't like to lose, so she asked for double the bet. She continued by telling me that Princess Lely of the Kingdom of Alberno had celebrated her 20th birthday a few months ago. The man immediately interrupted her, claiming that it was the 2nd of February. Valenti was indignant, saying that she had not finished the question and continued to explain. But the man continued to interrupt and give his answers. Indeed, you aristocrats in the Alberno kingdom have split into the Queen faction and the Serral faction, and there is a fierce power struggle between them. Valenti asked what was the worst gift Princess Lely had received for her anniversary from the Queen's faction, and why it was so. The man initially answered that it was the king's sword, but then changed his mind and claimed it was a different sword. Valenti pointed out that this was the wrong answer. Durek became indignant and asked what the correct answer was. The girl explained that the correct answer was the chapuri flower. He remarked that none of the papers he had read had mentioned such a gift. Valenti explained that it was to avoid offending the princess by not publicizing it. Durek asked if the chapuri flower carried some hidden meaning. Valenti replied that of course it did. She explained that the chapuri flower, though beautiful, fragrant and mysterious, symbolizes not the nicest things, and in the ruling class of Alberno, you will never be the first. It was humiliating for the princess who had been in second place all her life. Durek said that now everything was clear, and he was sad to lose. Valenti asked if he'd forgotten about the wish, since there were now 2. Durek said he was obliged to fulfill his promise, and asked what she wanted from him. The girl hesitated, and said that she didn't know exactly, but that she planned to use one of her wishes and leave the other for later. Durek remarked that that was clever of her. Eventually they went outside and got ready to walk around the square as agreed. When Valenti saw Durek, she was very surprised and asked if he had finally decided to take off his mask. She also complimented him, saying that his clothes were very becoming. Durek explained that he wore a mask to hide his identity, but Valenti reminded him that he had agreed to accompany her, so it was important to follow the norms. Valenti then asked if he liked her outfit, as she was dressed like an aristocrat, and asked if the color looked good on her. The man looked a little embarrassed and turned away, saying she looked fine. Valenti was annoyed, as she had expected him to give her some kind of compliment. She thought this outfit was much cuter and prettier than the one she usually wore to work. They continued walking and soon came to Lefen Square, the place where they had first met 8 years ago. Valenti pointed to the spot where she had fallen and remembered Durek reaching out to her. Durek looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. Valenti confirmed that it was, and she remembered it very well. He then asked why she said she had become a big fan of his after the incident. Valenti replied with a smile that she had begun to take an interest in news about him on a daily basis, checking the newspapers and saving articles, so she had been very surprised to meet him that day, and of course she recognized him immediately. But when she saw the surprised look on his face, she said that she wasn't a stalker at all. How could he think that? She's just a very avid fan who, if she recognizes a person, is willing to just follow them for the rest of her life. The man was wary. She said he understood. Then she decided to change the subject and suggested going to the market. He asked in surprise why she wanted to go there, and the girl, in turn, explained that she just hadn't been there in a very long time, and he was right in front of them quite a bit. To pass, if they have already come this far, they can further continue to enjoy the walk. Valenti could see perfectly well that he was very worried and anxious. It was not a problem, however. She put her arm around his waist again and pulled him forward, telling him to get going. She realized that she had to get him to meet one person soon, and to do that she had to go out in public. Soon they entered the market, where there were quite a few people present. They were not only traders but also visitors. As they passed by a shop, the man approached them and told them to come in and look at his goods. Maybe something would appeal to them and they would take it. Valenti immediately began to look at all of his wares and said that he had quite a lot of stuff. She turned to the gentleman and asked him if he wanted to see it all. She also added that he could choose whatever he wanted and they would buy it. Valentin replied that whatever he chose, it would all be a rewarding experience. Durek was a little wary, but then walked over to the bench and picked up the wooden thing and wondered what it was for. The girl who saw it said it was a bookshelf. Commoners don't have many books, so they have nowhere to store them, and this is quite a useful invention, which replaces a lot of stands in the apartment. The man hesitated and began to scrutinize her, and when the girl noticed it, she realized that he liked it. Valenti remained silent for a while longer. Then she said that if he liked her, he might as well buy her. The man, hesitating, said that he had not brought the princes with him. The girl asked in surprise what it was even, and didn't know that this empire had a currency called that. But she did not pursue the subject any further. So she simply paid for the purchase for the man, and he began to shine with joy, because it was his first purchase in a very long time. Valentine, smiling, went ahead and said they would show him other places as well. He agreed. A long time had passed since then. They went to various places in the market, and even went to a bookstore where Durek had picked out and seen many new books. They had bought quite a lot of goods, and he was carrying whole bags in his hands. When the girl saw this, she offered to carry some too. She reached for the packages, which the man began pushing away from her, and said she was so excited that she ended up even being rude and apologized for it. Then the man spoke up and said that up to that time he thought she had said she would accompany, and said it was all right, he had no trouble carrying all those purchases. She did accept the situation, but she didn't really like it. Soon she heard the prince's stomach rumbling and wondered if he was hungry. Durek was very embarrassed and said that he wasn't, because it was a strange sight. Valenti, in turn, smiled and wondered if he wouldn't mind, why they shouldn't eat. Since they were already at the market, it would be good for them to try market food. It's a lot of emotions and new sensations. The man hesitated for a while, but after that he still said that it was a pretty good idea, because he was very hungry. She, smiling, took his hand and said that in that case, she would see him off and take him to some very interesting and popular place. He did not object. Valenti suddenly thought about it, and suggested avoiding the tents as much as possible, since there was no getting out of them. The man asked her if she liked the cafeteria in the back. The girl, turning around, replied that he was a little farther away, but as soon as she looked away, she saw that he was no longer there. But soon she found him at the bakery. Durek was standing there with a very serious expression on his face, picking out a bun to eat. Some time passed, and they came to a nice place. They were brought bread and a bowl of soup. They immediately began to eat. and the girl noticed that he was eating with quite an appetite. Valenti hoped it suited his taste to eat bread with his hands, for he must have eaten much better in the imperial palace than he did right now. But at that moment, Durek turned to her and said that it was all delicious. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked him to repeat it. He, in turn, asked if she had not heard what he had said. Valenti, in turn, laughed nervously and said that she was just a little surprised, but also glad that he liked it all, as it was a pretty good chowder in the whole town. The man was silent for a while, and after that, smiling, he asked her to let him finish his meal. Of course, the girl didn't mind, because she wasn't very hungry at all. As soon as they went outside, everyone was very happy, because they had eaten a delicious and hearty meal. Valenti also offered to have a cup of tea. When Durek heard that, he thought about it for a while. Then he agreed to her proposal. She was very surprised to hear this and said that she knew a very good tea store nearby, so she suggested going there. He agreed, and the girl in turn thought happily of finally being able to show him after all these years. She held the paper in her hands and thought about the fact that if you looked at it that way, it was quite natural. She was sure there was nothing wrong with it. But at the same time, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. She glanced at the man to see if he was all right. Durek, for his part, looked at her too, and wondered why she was watching him so intently. The girl immediately felt uncomfortable and let go of his hand. After that, she quickened her step to avoid this awkward conversation. But the man followed her and asked why her ears were suddenly so red. Valenti, trying to be proud, said she was just hot, but thought she shouldn't have looked at him for so long. The girl was blushing because of her emotions, and soon they came to the right shop. As soon as she opened the door, she said hello to the owner. The boy said hello back to her, and when he turned his head to the side, he recognized her immediately. The man was Devileg Balloon, the owner of a cafe named Bologna, and he turned to the lady and said they had not seen her for a long time. He also said that he would like to hear the detailed story of what happened to her and Lady Anna. Valenti moved closer to him and smiled, and said that the young lady had married abroad, and she had found work elsewhere, and it was difficult for her to come so far away. She said she was incredibly happy to see him. Then she turned to the Baron and asked him how he was doing and what had been new in the meantime. The man replied that he was well and wished to ask the lady the same. This conversation went on for quite some time. To them, the prince, who was standing nearby, was completely unnoticed. Well before long, a man finally paid attention to him and inquired as to who he was in general. Valenti, smiling, replied that it was just an acquaintance of hers. In fact, she realized she couldn't call him a prince, so she decided to disguise him.